Okay, so we are ready to start, and this is Saturday morning, the 9 a.m. session. Okay, so we'll begin the day with the verse of homage to the Buddha. So you can recite along with me. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato Samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so we're ready to jump into the depths of our subject today. And so today we're going to be moving into the material on the sense bases and the elements in the Visuddhimagga, the path of purification, and these topics are dealt with in chapter 15 of the Visuddhimagga. But before we go into chapter 15, I just want to review the opening of chapter 14, the important points in the opening, which lays down the purpose for undertaking this investigation of the sense of the aggregates, the sense bases, the elements, and the other topics in this section of the work. Because as I said last night, the reason why these topics are subjected to such a detailed investigation is because these topics form the groundwork, or you could say the ground or basis or soil for the development of panya or wisdom. And so chapter 14 in the Visuddhimagga opens with a discussion of wisdom. And so, though I dealt with this last year, but it's useful just to refresh, to see why the texts are going into this investigation of the sense bases and elements. Okay, so Venerable Nyanamoli, the British monk who translated the Visuddhimagga, he used the word understanding for panya. Though now most translators use the rendering wisdom. And I would prefer wisdom myself, since understanding suggests too much just a conceptual or intellectual understanding. Okay, so this is the explanation of the particular mental factor called panya or wisdom, and it's done in terms of the commentaries analyze and explain the different mental factors using four particular characteristics or four particular aspects from which we investigate any particular dhamma, any particular thing. So these four, it seems that I can't, let's see if I could select it. A characteristic, function, manifestation, and proximate cause. Okay, so the characteristic of wisdom, I don't like the translation, but I'll read it the way he has it, is penetrating the individual essences of states. Okay, the word translated as states is dhammas. So dhammas are phenomena or things that have some kind of actual existence. So these are the ultimate sort of objects of investigation with wisdom are dhammas. The whole multiplicity, the whole plenum of phenomena. And to understand dhammas correctly, one has to penetrate something Jnanamoli is called, translated this, individual essences, which sounds, has anybody gone through Thomas Aquinas type of scholasticism? You have. This sounds like Thomian scholasticism. But the Pali word is sabhava, which might be better translated, I would translate as the real nature. So the characteristic of panya is to penetrate into the real nature of dhammas, the real nature of phenomena. And usually we say that the real nature of things, that there are two aspects to be penetrated. One is the specific characteristic of dhammas. Like each dhamma or each type of dhamma has its own specific nature. For example, the aggregate of material form has its specific nature. Feeling has its specific nature. Perception has its specific nature. The volitional activities, or so sankharas, have their specific nature. And consciousness has its specific nature. So that's one aspect of the real nature, is the specific nature, the specific characteristics of phenomena. And then the second aspect of the real nature is the general or common nature of all phenomena. And this is what's summed up in the three characteristics: impermanence, dukkha or unsatisfactoriness, and anatta, non-self. But here in these chapters, we're primarily concerned with the specific nature of phenomena. Okay, so the characteristic is to penetrate the real nature of dharmas, of phenomena. And then the function of wisdom is to abolish the darkness of delusion or the darkness of ignorance that conceals the real nature of phenomena. So this is the problem, the sort of the deepest problem of human existence, that our minds don't see things as they really are, but the mind is covered up with delusion or ignorance. And so instead of seeing things as they truly are, in terms of their sabhava, their real nature, we see them in terms of the distortions and delusions that are manufactured, constructed by the mind, and then projected out upon the phenomena the phenomena that we perceive, and we take those projections of the mind to be real. Maybe we could see the extreme case of this, not at the Buddhist philosophical level, but in the everyday level, when somebody is somewhat paranoid, and so they see, like, everybody is making fun of them, or other people are sort of following them, pursuing them in order to persecute them or to harm them. And so these are mental constructs which are created in the mind of the paranoid person and then projected out upon the real situation. So the person is riding in the subway train and somebody just looks up and gives them a casual glance, and that person is out to assassinate me. I better get off at the next station. And then there's a whole bunch of people chatting together at the next station, and they're planning to catch me when I get off. Okay, so these are that's an extreme example, but in everyday life, we project upon the objects of perception, we project imaginary ideas that arise in the mind itself and not in the nature of things themselves. And so the function of panya, or wisdom, is to dispel that darkness of delusion, that darkness of ignorance that's concealing the real nature of things. And then by dispelling that darkness of delusion, then we could penetrate into the real nature of things. And so wisdom is then manifested as the absence of delusion, because there's clear understanding, and so that clear understanding is what replaces the delusion. And then in terms specifically of the meditative wisdom, the proximate cause is samadhi, concentration, because in order to see things correctly, one has to apply the collected, unified, concentrated mind. Okay, so this is sort of an overview of panya, or wisdom, in terms of its 4 aspects. Okay, now we can jump to chapter 15 on the sense bases. Okay, and a little warning on this material. I don't know if any of you have attempted to read it on your own, but when you read the suttas, you can see that they're very clear, direct, simple but not shallow, sort of very directly illuminating. But when you come to a text like Visuddhimagga or the Pali commentaries, it's like from the suttas, suddenly it's like coming from an open field and you're in a dense jungle thicket, and every place you try to put your foot, it's getting tangled in vines. And then there are swamps ahead, and you don't know where are the vines, where are the swamps. So these texts like Visuddhimagga and the commentaries, sometimes I think a little sacrilegiously, that they were written by monks with too much time on their hands. So it comes out of a kind of a very rich scholastic culture in which, in the generations and maybe centuries after the passing away of the Buddha, the different generations of monks had devised very complex explanatory methods, very complex analytical methods for explaining the Dhamma, the teachings that come down in the suttas. And since they come out of a literary culture rather than an oral culture like the suttas, they make use of very, very complicated literary devices for explaining the texts and the doctrines. And sometimes they seem, I have to say, a bit too clever for themselves, using word plays which for us today are not very meaningful. In fact, they really only make sense in the Pali language. And these word plays are sometimes not completely convincing. Okay, so let us start, and I'm going to try to make this, to sort of paraphrase it, whatever I'm going to select, to paraphrase it and to make it clear, simple, and direct. Okay, so we have, this chapter is devoted to the bases, the sense bases. Those are the ayatana, and the elements. Those are the dhatu. And so first we have an enumeration of the bases, the ayatana. So what are the ayatana? There are 12 sense bases. So here they are. They're put in pairs by way of the internal base and the external base. So there's the eye base and its corresponding external base, which is called here the visible database. Then the ear base, sound base, nose base, odor base, tongue, flavor, body, the tangible datum or the tactile object. Maybe we could say textures or touch sensations. Then the mind base, and it has its corresponding external base, which is in Pali, it's called the Dhammayatana. So the word Dhamma is a word with many, many meanings, very dependent on context. And so in relation to the internal mind base, its specific object or its specific external base is called the Dhammayatana, which doesn't mean Dhamma in the sense of the Buddha's teaching, but it means, as we'll see, particular types of objects that are accessible to the mind as the internal faculty, corresponding to the sense organs as the external sense bases. Okay, then the Visuddhimagga goes into a long section trying to explain etymologically each of these bases, which is not entirely, won't be readily intelligible in English, so I skip over that. Okay, now it proceeds to give some explanation. Oh no, this is still continuing with the word explanation. Now it's explaining the meaning of ayatana. And so it sums up and it says that these things are called ayatana bases because they actuate, because they are the range of the origins, and because they lead on to what is actuated. If this doesn't sound like normal English to you, that's quite understandable. And if any of you have English as a second language, and then you think, we have trouble with this, but those who have English as a primary language certainly understand it. Guess again, because it's not the case. Even if I read that without looking at the Pali, I don't understand it. But this is a good explanation. So base should be understood in the sense of the place of abode, store, meeting place, locality of birth and cause. I think this is the important explanation. The I and so forth are the meeting place for these various states of consciousness, and let's go this way. Okay. Okay, the various states of consciousness and its concomitants. The concomitants are the mental factors that arise together with consciousness, dwell in the I because they exist in dependence on them. So the I and so forth are their place of abode. And they frequent the I because they have the I and so forth as their material support, and then they have forms as their object. And so the I are their storage place. And then the I and so forth are the meeting place because the I and forms meet together in these ayatanas, using them as physical basis, door, and object, and so on. Okay, now we come to the character of each of these bases, each of these sense bases. And for an explanation of this, the text refers us to the section in the description of the aggregates. But we don't have to actually go to that chapter, since I could explain what they are. Okay, when we speak about the I as a sense base, technically, it's not referring to the entire I organ as such, but what is said is that within the I, there is a kind of subtle matter which is called pasada, chaku pasada. Okay, the chaku pasada is a subtle type of matter located someplace within the physical eye that is sensitive to light and colors. I say that it corresponds maybe to the rods and cones of the modern science of vision. So the eye organ as a whole is sort of an assemblage of many constituents, and its primary function is to serve as a support for this subtle type of matter that is able to receive visible forms, colors, shades of light, and then transform them into images which can then be picked up by eye consciousness. And this subtle matter, this sensitive matter, is said to arise on the basis of the primary constituents of matter. The primary constituents are the primary elements: earth, water, fire, and air, representing the properties of solidity, cohesion, heat, and motion. So those are the primary qualities of matter. And then based on those primary qualities, various secondary qualities arise. And one of those secondary qualities is this sensitive property of the eye through which we're able to pick up visible forms. Similarly, in regard to the ear, what is called the ear base is not this thing here. So we say somebody has big ears, little ears, long ears, and so on. Dr. Spock, was it in the Star Trek, has pointy ears, if I remember. Okay, but that, in terms of the ayatanas, is not the ear base, But all of this is sort of like a protective surrounding for the real ear base. The real ear base is somewhere inside here, a kind of subtle matter that is sensitive to vibrations of the air, and that turns those vibrations of the air into sounds. Maybe this would correspond to like the inner ear. I'm not so sure about physiology. The eardrum, perhaps. So it's what's sensitive to when there are sounds which externally they're just vibrations of the air, but they turn into sounds when those vibrations strike on the sensitive matter of the ear. Yeah, that would be called, I think it's sota pasada, ear sensitivity. And similarly for the nose base is not this protuberance here, but some have short nose, flat nose, long nose, and so on. But this is not the nose base, but somewhere inside, maybe up, located up, deep inside, there is a kind of sensitive matter that is sensitive to odors, and that serves as the base for the arising of nose consciousness, so that there will be like chemicals floating through the air. If somebody is preparing, say, a stew of a particular kind, then these molecules float through the air and we breathe them in, and those molecules strike against that sensitive matter of the nose, and then we can smell, a stew is being prepared. Or if somebody is burning incense, you could smell from the distance, that's a jasmine incense or a sandal incense. So there's that sensitive matter, that's the base for the arising of nose consciousness. Okay, then there is the tongue sensitivity. So the tongue sensitivity is sort of spread out over the surface of the tongue, and perhaps this will correspond to what we now call taste buds. So this is a kind of material phenomena that is sensitive to tastes, that can distinguish whether this is sour, sweet, bitter, salty, particular tastes. This is strawberry ice cream, vanilla ice cream. What is maple fudge? Is there such a thing? Maple fudge ice cream? Okay, so that is the taste sensitive, or tongue sensitivity, which serves as the basis for the perception of flavors, different flavors. And then the body base is not just this whole physical body itself, but it's a sensitive kind of matter that's spread out over the surface of the body and probably throughout the internal organs as well. So if we have an upset stomach, we can feel upset in the stomach. If we have palpitations of the heart, we could feel the heart palpitating. So it's also inside as well as on the surface of the skin. And that is the kaya pasada, the body sensitivity. Which is that material substance that is sensitive to tactile sensations. So we can tell whether something is smooth, something is rough, something is hard, something is soft. something is hot, something is cold. And we could identify different textures, whether silk, wool, all the different textures we can know through body sensitivity. And so I've now explained the 5 internal sense bases, and in explaining them, I also explained the 5 corresponding external sense bases. So we have the visible form base. Those would be colors, basically colors, which we then pattern through the activity of the mind into different shapes, and then identify objects based on their colors and shapes. Then various sounds, then odors, tastes, and tactile sensations. And now we come to the other 2 bases, and this is where it gets a bit interesting. Let's see if... Okay, here's where there comes to be some different possibilities for different interpretations. Okay, now the Abhidhamma takes the 6th base, the Manai Atana, to be or to comprise all types of consciousness. So every type of consciousness, every citta, according to the Abhidhamma, is included in the mind base. So whether it's eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and all the different types of mind consciousness are all included in the mind base. And then the Dhammayatana, this is getting a little technical now. One would think that the Dhammayatana will be just mental objects. But what the Abhidhamma includes in the Dhammayatana, you see, there was a sutta that I didn't discuss last night. Let me call that up. It's that sutta on the all. And so the sutta says, in the sutta the Buddha says, I will teach you the all, the eye and forms, ear and sounds, nose and odors, tongue and taste, body and tactile objects, the mind and mental objects. Okay, so the sutta says this is the all. And so the Abhidhamma takes this very literally and therefore holds that the mind base includes all types of consciousness, and the Dhammayatana includes, we have to find a place, if it's going to include everything, there has to be a place for the aggregates of feeling, perception, volitional activities, which are then some 50 chaitasikas, other types of material phenomena, not included in sensory experience, and then nibbana, which is also an object of internal consciousness. And so all of these things get included in the Dhammayatana. Just about everything that's not included in the other ayatanas. So that is the way the Abhidhamma treats the mind base and the Dhamma base. But when we look at the suttas, here there seems to be a difference, as I said, a difference in point of view. The suttas seem to be treating the mind base as the door for the arising of mind consciousness, as a kind of internal faculty that on the basis of which mind consciousness arises. Just as the other bases are the bases for the arising of their corresponding types of consciousness. So from that point of view, we would say that, and this is recognized by the Visuddhimagga, that the I and forms, those are the bases for the arising of I consciousness. The ear and sounds are the basis for the arising of ear consciousness. The nose and odor is the basis for the arising of nose consciousness. The tongue and flavors, the basis for the arising of tongue consciousness. The body and tactile sensations, the basis for the arising of body consciousness. And then it would follow that the mind base and is the internal base for the arising of mind consciousness, that is the purely mental consciousness, and Dhammayatana would be the distinctive objects of that internal mind consciousness. And so we could see the Visuddhimagga recognizing this when it says that only one part of the mind base, in other words, the life continuum mind, this is what is called the bhavanga citta, is the door for the arising of the sixth consciousness, that's the mind consciousness. And only one part of the mental database, the Dhammayatana, is the object of that sixth mind consciousness. And then it says they are called 12 because they define the door together with the object for the arising of the six types of consciousness. You can see here it says that the mind base is of 89 kinds or 121 kinds. So in other words, it's saying that the mind base is equivalent to all of the types of consciousness or cittas, since there are said to be 89 or 121 kinds of cittas in the Abhidhamma. And then the mental database, that's the Dhammayatana, is of many kinds when classified by way of feeling, perception, mental formations, subtle matter, and nibbana. Okay, then we come to some further discussion on how they are to be seen. And this brings up the important point that usually we think of the eye as something which is lasting and enduring. And so for the ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and their objects, we think of them as somehow enduring and persisting through time. But according to the Buddha's teaching, all of the sense bases, internal and external, are subject to constant arising and passing away. They come into existence through conditions, in dependence on conditions. And it's said here that all of the form bases, or all the condition bases, that is everything except Nibbana, should be regarded as having, he uses such formal literary language, no provenance and no destination. To put it into simpler English, that there's no place from which they come, and before they arise, no place from which they come, and when they vanish, there's no place to which they go. In other words, they have just a transitory existence, a transient existence. At moment X, a particular moment of the eye doesn't exist. At moment Y, that moment of the eye comes into being, and at moment Z, that event of the eye passes away. And so what we think of as the eye, we think of it as something persisting through time. So that's the eye at the present. So we think that it's been existing all along from the past. Here we are at the present moment of the eye. And after this moment of the eye is going to go on existing into the future. But when we look actually from using like the tool of insight investigation, look at the nature of the eye, we find that there are just like a series of occasions of eye, each one arising and passing, arising and passing. Very, very quickly, so that they're all run together because they arise and pass away so quickly. They're run together, and we get that impression of the stable eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. But when we look at them, with close attention, especially through the development of mindfulness and clear comprehension, we see that the eye arises and passes away, arises and passes from moment to moment. So what we usually think of as the eye is just a continuum of individual moments, individual acts of the eye arising and passing. Okay, just to take the last part of this, I didn't really like, again, I have some reservations about this translation. Okay, they should be regarded as, he uses the word incurious and uninterested, which I found puzzling. What exactly does he mean by this? So then I had to look up the actual meaning of nir-i-hukata, and it comes from a verb which means making a deliberate effort. So the idea here is that these sense bases don't make a deliberate effort to exercise their functions, but their functions just occur naturally. So that there's no deliberate effort that's near ihukata and upyaparata. Let's say that there's no exertion on their part, no deliberate effort and no exertion. And you get the sense of this, so it doesn't occur to the eye and the visible form, let consciousness arise from our concurrence, from our encounter. But it's just sort of the nature of things. He says the absolute rule that when there is the encounter of the eye with the visible form, eye consciousness arises. When there is the encounter of the ear with the sound, ear consciousness will arise. Similarly, in the other senses. So these internal bases don't make a deliberate effort to serve as the base for their respective type of consciousness. They don't exert themselves, but it's just the nature of things that the internal sense bases have their function as serving as the base for the arising of consciousness, and the external bases have their function as serving as the objects of consciousness. Okay, this is what the Visuddhimagga says about the sense bases. Now I think, well, I'll try to fit in the elements in 10 minutes. Okay, now we have 10 elements. We have 18 elements. The Pali word here is dhatu. And it's exactly the same word that you might know if you are familiar with the names of the 4 primary elements. So we have the Patavi Dhatu, that's the earth element, the Apo Dhatu, the water element, the Tejo Dhatu, the fire element, the Vayu Dhatu, the air element. It's the same word, but here it's used with in a different context. So here there are 18 elements, and of these 18, you'll see that 12 of them correspond to the 12 sense bases. Okay, so we have eye element, the visible form element. Can you see this in the back? Okay. Okay. And then we have the new one that's introduced, eye consciousness element. And similarly with the others, with the ear, nose, tongue, body. So here we have body element, the tactile object element, body consciousness element, and then we have the last one, mind element. In Pali, this is manodhatu. Then the mental data element, this is dhammadhatu. And then mind consciousness element, the mano vijnana dhatu. Okay, so I'll skip over the verbal derivations, again, which makes sense only in Pali, and even then it's rather difficult to understand. But this is an important point made in the commentary to the Visuddhimagga. It says that, okay, but one of the meanings of element, again, this is rather scholastic language, it says the bearing of mere individual essences or things with a real nature without any permanent living being is a basic meaning of the word dhatu. And so the point that's being stated here is that the reason why the Buddha teaches these 18 elements, one of the reasons is to show or to dissolve the clinging to the idea that there's some kind of permanent entity within ourselves, some kind of permanent self, some kind of stable soul entity, that we could say, this is me, this is what I am, this is myself. Because when the Buddha shows that there are these 18 elements that make up experience, so that experience is the interplay of these 18 elements, then there's no foothold left for this idea of a self, of a substantial living being, a permanent living being. But there's just this conditioned interplay of elements. And here that same point is made in the Visuddhimagga when it says, element is a term for what is soulless. Again, I don't quite like that word, but what's being rejected is something called the jiva, which was a fundamental idea of, especially of the Jains in the time of the Buddha. They held that every living being is constituted, sort of at the center of every living being, there is the jiva, the soul. And that soul is what transmigrates from life to life. And this idea was also adopted by the Hindus, so that Hinduism holds that there is the jiva, the permanent soul, which is identical in its essence with the Atman, the universal self. And so what the Buddha teaches is elements which are devoid of the jiva, that kind of permanent entity. And so it's for the purpose of abolishing the perception of soul that the Blessed One, the Buddha, taught the elements. Okay, then again, we have, they are stated as 18 for the purpose of eliminating the kind of perception to be found in those who perceive a soul in consciousness. So the aspect of experience that we're most inclined to grasp upon as being the soul is consciousness. And so in the teaching on the 18 elements, the Buddha teaches that there are actually these 7 aspects of consciousness. There's, when we're seeing forms, that's the activity of eye consciousness. When we're hearing sounds, that's the activity of ear consciousness. When smelling, tasting, touching, feeling touch sensations, that's the activity of body consciousness. When cognizing mental objects, that's the activity of manovinyana, mind consciousness. And so the Blessed One, desirous of eliminating the long inherent perception of a soul, has expounded the 18 elements, thus making evident to them, to those who hold the idea of soul, not only that consciousness is multiple, because there are many different kinds, but also its impermanence, because each type of consciousness exists in dependence on its own particular door, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind faculty, and has its own distinctive object. And since the door of consciousness, the organ on the basis of which it arises, and the object are impermanent, this means that consciousness too is impermanent. So there's no basis for grasping on consciousness and saying, this is myself, this is my soul. So in this way we get the 18 elements. An interesting question that arises when we take in the scheme of the ayatanas, we have manayatana. And then when we come to the dhatus, that gets broken up into mano dhatu, and mano vijnana dhatu. So an interesting question is, what is the relationship between mano dhatu and mano vijnana dhatu? And this is where the Abhidhamma developed its own distinctive scheme of explanation. So how we understand the relationship between mano dhatu and mano vijnana dhatu. Okay, I see that it's time for a break, so I think this is a good time to break. If questions occur to you when I'm speaking, you can write them down. If you want, you could write them down on little slips of paper and then put them up here, and then we could take them during the evening session. Otherwise, you can make a note of them and then you could ask them. At points, I'm going to stop to ask for questions. But now, in this session, I wanted to cover the Visuddhimagga presentation on the sense bases and elements. And so we'll pause now. We have, it looks like from 10 to 10:20. Yeah, we have a 20-minute break. So you can go to the dining hall if you like to have some tea, or go to the restroom. And then please, again, this is one of the rules, you have to be here exactly by 10:20, because if people start strolling in 10:21, 22, 25, it breaks the concentration, because I'm going to start precisely at 10:20, and then we don't want to break my concentration or the concentration of the other students. Okay, so let us take our break.